Everyone thinks World War II was fought between nations, between flags, ideologies. Hitler versus Churchill, the Axis versus the Allies. But what if that wasn't the real story? What if the war, beneath the slogans and speeches, became the single greatest corporate acceleration event in modern history? Not just a war of armies, but a mobilization of industries, one that permanently rewired the global economy. Because while countries were rationing food and burying their dead, a handful of companies were compounding, gaining power, building infrastructure, writing contracts that were worth more than gold. And when the last bomb dropped, they didn't go away. They stayed. In fact, they expanded. Look closely. Behind every military success, there was a ledger. Behind every tank, a balance sheet. Behind every patriotic poster, a procurement deal. Ford didn't just produce cars, it mass-produced bombers, one every 63 minutes. Standard Oil didn't just supply fuel, it shaped the entire petroleum strategy of the war. Boeing turned from a struggling aircraft maker into a titan of the skies. IBM created punch card systems for logistics, then later helped governments process entire populations. Siemens? They walked straight through the moral fire of war and emerged with contracts, patents, and access to post-war reconstruction money. And it wasn't an accident. It was a system, designed, legal, profitable, backed by bureaucracies, stock markets, and armies, and in many cases, continued after the war ended. Not just tolerated, but integrated into the foundations of the New World Order. You've heard that World War II was the good war, the one that defeated fascism and brought freedom to the world. And in some ways, yes, it did. But while politicians spoke of liberty, executives were drafting the next decade's revenue. The real story of World War II isn't just military victory, it's corporate metamorphosis. It's how war became the most profitable R&D lab in history, subsidized by taxpayers, protected by governments, and paid for in lives. If you're wondering why certain companies seem untouchable today, follow the money back to 1942. Look past the generals, look past the flags, follow the factories, follow the financing. Because the true superpowers didn't run for office, they filed for contracts. To understand how corporations rose on the back of World War II, we need to go back. Not to 1939, but to the decades before the war, because none of this happened by accident. Wars don't just appear out of nowhere. Neither do trillion-dollar supply chains. They are built, funded, prepared, years in advance. Let's start in America. By the 1920s, the U.S. was already dreaming of scale, assembly lines, mass production, standardization. Henry Ford had shown that you could build a car faster than a man could eat lunch. The government watched closely. And when the Great Depression hit in 1929, it didn't turn to charity, it turned to industry. That's when the lines between government and corporate power began to blur. Under Roosevelt's New Deal, federal agencies started pumping public money into infrastructure, energy, and manufacturing. In theory, this was to stimulate demand and put people to work. But in practice, it created a testing ground, public funding for private profit. And the corporations learned fast. Standard Oil, already one of the most powerful trusts in history, positioned itself as an energy backbone. Ford Motor Company, despite Henry Ford's vocal isolationism, was still tightly integrated into industrial planning. Boeing was kept afloat with military mail contracts in the 30s. IBM sold its tabulators to the Social Security Administration. None of this was labeled as war prep, but it was. By the mid-1930s, the U.S. War Department had already begun scenario planning, quietly contracting companies to figure out what it would take to build tanks, planes, rifles at scale. They didn't have the factories, but they knew who did. That's when the arsenal of democracy was born, not in speeches, but in blueprints. But America wasn't alone in this. Germany was doing the same. Siemens had been feeding on state contracts since the German Empire days. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, Siemens was already embedded in infrastructure, energy, and communications. The Nazi regime didn't have to nationalize them, it simply directed them. IBM's German subsidiary De Homag licensed punch card technology to the Reich. It's a fact. This wasn't espionage, it was business. Managed from New York, executed in Berlin. Meanwhile, in Britain, the Air Ministry was courting Vickers, Supermarine, Rolls-Royce, offering subsidies to develop engines and airframes. The reason? War was coming. And governments knew that they couldn't build fast enough on their own. They needed corporations that could move faster than bureaucracies. What emerged was a new kind of alliance. Not public, not fully private, something murkier. Corporations were now strategic assets, too important to fail, too valuable to ignore. Their factories were counted as defense readiness. Their patents were considered national secrets. And their growth was wrapped in the language of patriotism. In America, the National Defense Advisory Commission was created in 1940. On the surface, it was about protecting the homeland. But dig deeper, and you find that its main role was to negotiate contracts with companies, to lock in supply lines, to guarantee profit margins. This wasn't charity. This was structure. A system where companies got assured orders and in return agreed to produce at scale. Not for the free market, not for consumer demand, but for war. The government fronted the capital, built the factories, paid for the raw materials, and the corporations operated them with their own labor, their own processes, and eventually their own leverage. Because once you become essential, you don't ask for money, you name your price. That's how Boeing, which had been teetering on collapse during the Depression, received a lifeline, orders for bombers, thousands of them, and not just paid per plane, paid to expand, build plants, train workers, patent designs. It was the same logic used in ancient empires. The Roman state didn't build every sword. It contracted blacksmiths, funded mines, stabilized currency to ensure metal delivery. And when the war ended, those blacksmiths didn't disappear. They raised their prices. World War II became the Roman Empire on steroids, with spreadsheets. And when you realize this, everything changes. You stop seeing Ford as a car company. It was an Air Force partner. You stop seeing IBM as a tech firm. It was a logistics coordinator. Standard Oil didn't just fuel the Allies. It controlled where and when energy would flow. Siemens didn't just build switches. It built the communication networks used by totalitarian states. These companies weren't dragged into war. They were already at the table. By the time the first American troops landed in Europe, the contracts were signed, the financing arranged, the production lines humming. The war hadn't even started on the battlefield, but the profits were already secured in boardrooms. And when you build a system like this, where the state guarantees the risk and corporations keep the reward, it doesn't stop when the war ends. It becomes permanent. Once the system was built, contracts flowing, factories expanding, government money replacing market forces, something strange happened. Everyone started to believe it could last forever. This is the phase history always dresses in glory, the golden age, the miracle, the post-war boom. But look beneath the surface, and you'll see it wasn't peace that built the modern world. It was momentum. The wartime industrial machine didn't slow down in 1945. It accelerated. Because for the corporations that had grown fat on war, peace was just another campaign, a rebranding. Same machine, new purpose. Let's start with Boeing. During the war, Boeing's income came almost entirely from military contracts. At peak, the company was producing over 350 aircraft a month. Massive bombers like the B-17 and B-29, built with public money, designed in partnership with the U.S. Army Air Forces. When the war ended, Boeing didn't go back to the private market. It pivoted into military jets, then commercial aviation. But here's the trick. Even the commercial side was subsidized. Airports were federally funded. Air traffic control, public. Fuel research, government-backed. The entire post-war aviation industry was born from a military-industrial umbilical cord that never got cut. That's how Boeing grew from a regional aircraft maker into a geopolitical force. Not because of free market innovation, but because it had mastered something better, relationship economics. Now take IBM. During the war, IBM's punch card systems were used to track troops, logistics, and shipments, a revolution in data processing. When the war ended, they didn't return to typewriters and clocks. They scaled their tabulation business into every level of government and finance. By the 1950s, IBM machines were running the U.S. Census, the IRS, the Pentagon's logistics, all paid for by federal budgets. And when computing moved from mechanical to digital, IBM already had the one thing no startup could replicate: contracts. Long-term, institutional, inflation-proof. This is the illusion phase, when it all looks like progress. Corporations are growing, employment is booming, stock prices are rising. But underneath, the system is rigged for those already inside. Ford, for example, turned its wartime expertise in mass production into dominance over post-war auto manufacturing. But it wasn't just about cars. Ford was part of a tightly coordinated system of road construction, suburban housing, and petroleum dependence. Highways were federally funded under Eisenhower. Suburbs were financed by the GI Bill. And guess what fueled all of it? Standard Oil. By 1945, Standard Oil had not only supplied over 80% of the Allies' aviation fuel, it had also gained international concessions from the Middle East to Latin America. In fact, one of the least discussed outcomes of World War II is how it redrew the oil map of the world. After the war, U.S. oil giants, not just Standard, but also Texaco, Gulf, Mobil, were handed de facto control over global energy flows, protected by military alliances, paid in U.S. dollars, settled through the new financial order built at Bretton Woods. When you hear the phrase, the American century, this is what it means. Not just political dominance, but corporate continuity. A global economy quietly reconstructed to keep these wartime firms in motion. Even in Germany, the story followed a similar rhythm. Siemens, though partially dismantled after the war, was never truly punished. By the 1950s, it was already building again. Infrastructure, electrical grids, communication systems, all under the Marshall Plan. American aid money poured into Europe, and much of it flowed right back into the hands of contractors like Siemens. It wasn't just rebuilding, it was retooling. Same engineers, same patents, same institutions. A new flag, but the same business model. This is how the illusion works. Governments claimed victory, but quietly handed control to companies that had been there since the beginning. The state handled diplomacy. Corporations handled logistics. And when voters asked why prices were rising, or why foreign wars kept erupting, or why certain firms always got the contracts, the answer was always some version of national interest. It felt modern, clean, rational. But at its core, it was medieval. Monopolies protected by kings, renamed as strategic industries. And like all illusions, it came with its own myths, that competition would emerge, that markets were free, that growth would lift all boats. But the boats were already owned. The docks were pre-sold. The ocean was chartered. It's not that the corporations lied. They didn't need to. They just kept delivering what the state needed: stability, supply, and plausible deniability. If you were a taxpayer in 1950, you thought you were funding recovery. In reality, you were buying stock in the same companies that profited from war. And by then, the illusion was complete. The line between democracy and corporation had blurred into something else, a system where public money flowed in, private power flowed out, and nobody asked too many questions. Every illusion runs on trust until the numbers stop adding up. By the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, the post-war boom began to crack. On paper, the war-born giants were thriving. Boeing was building the 747. IBM was dominating global computing. Standard Oil had its hands in every gas pump. Ford was exporting Americana on 4 wheels. Siemens was electrifying Europe. But behind the press releases and glossy brochures, something was rotting. Because when you build a system on infinite growth, but the inputs, oil, trust, money, are finite, the math eventually catches up. Always. Let's start with the most fragile illusion, the dollar itself. For decades, the world economy had been pinned to a gold standard, technically to the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. The U.S. promised to redeem dollars for gold at $35 per ounce. This gave the world a sense of stability, a kind of post-war financial religion. The dollar is as good as gold. But behind the altar, Washington was printing, funding wars, subsidizing industries, running twin deficits, one military, one trade, and financing it all with promises. The private sector, flush with government contracts, didn't care. Boeing, for instance, lived off Pentagon money and rising airline orders. But as inflation crept in and fuel costs rose, the 747, the queen of the skies, began looking more like a flying liability. It was too big, too expensive, and built on the assumption that jet fuel would remain cheap forever. Then came the 1973 oil shock. OPEC, fed up with U.S. support for Israel and tired of being underpaid for their own resources, cut production. Prices quadrupled. Fuel was suddenly the most precious commodity in the world. And guess who had built the global economy to require cheap oil at every step? Standard Oil and its descendants. What had been invisible now became obvious. The Western economy didn't run on freedom, it ran on subsidized petroleum. And the entire industrial system, from Detroit to Dusseldorf, began to wobble. Ford, once the model of manufacturing might, faced slumping sales. Japanese and German automakers, more efficient, less bloated by military-era contracts, began to take over the market. Americans suddenly realized they'd built highways for cars no one could afford to drive. And IBM? It had dominated mainframe computing, protected by long government contracts. But it had grown lazy, arrogant. While new players, Microsoft, Apple, Intel, were moving fast, IBM was stuck selling to bureaucracies, not users. Its bureaucracy became its blind spot. The illusion of eternal corporate dominance cracked from both ends. Rising costs, falling trust. Meanwhile, the dollar could no longer carry the weight of the system. France, under de Gaulle, demanded gold instead of paper. Others followed. The U.S. gold reserves began bleeding. So in 1971, Nixon did the unthinkable. He closed the gold window. The dollar was no longer backed by anything except confidence, and the confidence was already fraying. In that moment, the entire post-war economic architecture, the one built on World War II, on corporate state alliances, on fixed exchange rates, on cheap oil and military superiority, began to collapse. It didn't happen all at once. That's the trick with systems like this. They unravel slowly, then suddenly. Siemens, by the late 70s, was exposed in multiple corruption scandals related to state contracts. Ford laid off tens of thousands. Boeing nearly went bankrupt. IBM entered what it called a lost decade. Standard Oil? It had already been broken up in 1911, but its descendants, Exxon, Chevron, Mobil, were now exposed to political risk in every corner of the globe. The illusion of unstoppable growth gave way to a harsher truth. These corporations weren't invincible. They were addicted to government money, to stable commodities, to passive consumers. And as soon as any of those pillars shifted, the cracks showed. Here's the hidden truth. They had never truly been independent businesses. They were structures, engineered during wartime, maintained through policy, and dependent on conditions that no longer existed. They had been insulated by war, inflated by peace. But reality, when it arrived, had no contracts. And just like the assignats in revolutionary France, or Weimar marks in 1923, or Zimbabwe's trillion-dollar bills, arithmetic cannot be deceived. Not by flags, not by corporations, not by GDP reports. In every era, the numbers eventually call the bluff, and this era was no exception. You'd think after a system collapse, after Nixon closed the gold window, after oil shocks, inflation spikes, layoffs, and corporate humiliation, we'd build something new. But we didn't. We didn't dismantle the war economy. We financialized it. Instead of factories, we built spreadsheets. Instead of bombers, we built derivatives. Instead of government contracts for tanks, we handed out quantitative easing to banks, and defense budgets kept growing anyway. Look around today. The logos changed, the offices got nicer, the slogans got softer, But the game stayed the same. Take Boeing. After limping through the 1970s, Boeing reinvented itself not through engineering genius, but through mergers, lobbying, and government dependency. In the post-9/11 world, Boeing became not just a plane manufacturer, but a surveillance, weapons, and satellite contractor. Its military division now earns billions annually, from the Pentagon, from foreign governments, from programs with no market risk and guaranteed margins. Commercial aircraft? Just a side hustle with public optics. The core business is still rooted in the structure that World War II created. The state pays, the company builds, no one takes the blame. Or look at IBM. Once the king of hardware, IBM today lives on government contracts and AI patents, yet somehow pays less tax than many small businesses. In 2020, it was revealed IBM had paid $0 in federal tax that year, despite billions in revenue. Why? Because they operate within a legal financial maze designed to protect post-war titans. That's not just corporate strategy, it's the shadow of a system designed in 1942. Siemens? Still a giant, still state integrated, still one of the largest recipients of European infrastructure and energy transition funds. It rebranded, smart cities, green energy, digital grids. But when you follow the contracts, the subsidies, the revolving door between regulators and boardrooms, you realize it's the same logic. Government-backed, risk-deflected, influence-rich. And the oil giants? Standard Oil is dead in name only. Its children, ExxonMobil, Chevron, still receive billions in subsidies every year. In 2022 alone, fossil fuel companies globally received over $7 trillion in direct and indirect subsidies, according to the IMF. That's not a free market. That's a welfare state for multinationals. And just like in the 1940s, energy is once again the lever. Wars still run on it, currencies are still backed by it, and the petrodollar, the arrangement born in the 1970s between the US and Saudi Arabia, acts like a shadow gold standard for our debt-based economy. These aren't conspiracy theories, they're receipts. Follow the budget of any modern state and you'll see the same post-war rhythm. Defense spending as a stabilizer, tech firms getting government research grants, infrastructure public-private partnerships that socialize cost and privatize profit. What began in World War II as a necessary mobilization, the state funding private industry for survival, never fully unwound. It just changed shape. We didn't go back to normal after the war. We made the war economy permanent, first with the Cold War, then with the War on Terror, then with climate and pandemic emergencies. Each crisis, real or manufactured, is another opportunity to re-trigger the machine. Emergency, funding, corporate surge, lobbying, capture, repeat. And you might think, well, at least it creates innovation, jobs, progress. Sometimes it does, but innovation isn't the goal. The goal is control. Look at the rise of Silicon Valley. Most people assume it was born from garage startups and venture capital, but the foundation was government funding. DARPA, NASA, military contracts. Even Google's search algorithm came out of a Stanford project funded by the US Department of Defense. Just like IBM in the 40s, the new tech giants grew in the warm greenhouse of state money and state priorities. Today, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, all deeply embedded with the US government. Cloud computing for the CIA, AI development for the Pentagon, logistics and surveillance tools for law enforcement. You think it's different from Boeing in 1943? It's not. It's just cleaner, smoother, digitized. This is the modern echo. We no longer call them war corporations. We call them strategic partners. We don't say subsidy. We say investment. We don't see occupation. We see market access. But the structure is identical. Public risk, private gain, political theater, economic consolidation. And most of the population, as in 1945 or 1971, doesn't see the mechanism. They see only the outputs, new tech, new jobs, new threats to fear. Meanwhile, the same companies keep writing history in balance sheets. Here's the sobering thought. The system didn't collapse when the math broke in the 1970s. It mutated, like a parasite switching hosts. From factories to finance, from gold to debt, from soldiers to data. And the beneficiaries? Still there, still building, still untouchable. Systems don't collapse because of bad intentions. They collapse when numbers outgrow gold, outpace income, outrun trust. World War II didn't just end with peace treaties and victory parades. It ended with a blueprint, one that showed exactly how to convert national fear into corporate permanence. You fund an emergency, you build around it, and then you don't stop. Every generation since has been living inside that blueprint. Boeing didn't win a war, it learned how to win the budget cycle. IBM didn't innovate freedom, it digitized bureaucracy. Ford didn't just sell cars, it sold roads, zoning, asphalt, and lifestyle. And Standard Oil? It became a fuel protocol for civilization. Once a company becomes an operating layer of the state, it's no longer a business. It's a platform, unaccountable, untouchable, and often invisible. That's the danger. Not that corporations grow. Growth is natural, but that we forget the conditions that created them and pretend it was all merit. We teach school children that World War II was a triumph of democracy over tyranny, but we rarely mention how it also forged a corporate aristocracy that no parliament can vote out. We think we live in a market, but what we really live in is a managed economy, shaped by wartime logic, filtered through peacetime illusions. And history warns us, when institutions outgrow scrutiny, collapse is a matter of time. Rome handed its empire to tax farmers. France let assignats replace value with paper. The British Empire became so entangled with the East India Company that the flag followed the ship. Today, flags follow corporate servers. Wars are fought with procurement software. And monetary policy bails out balance sheets larger than most national economies. If you're hearing this in 2025, know this: the system hasn't reformed. It's just become harder to see. But arithmetic still waits at the door. It always does.